I'm Justin Walker.
I'm Kara Sirks.
I'm Jacob Silverman.
I'm Annie Zadi.
And I am Nils Ivars.
Long lines and intimidation are just two of the issues voters face in today's America.
How did we end up here? And how can a legal system protect the right to vote?
That's the story tonight on 6 Minutes.
Tension outside early voting sites.
And people like that will certainly exist in the United States and
fears of confrontations and voter intimidation at the polls.
Of course, the risks of mail-in voting are obvious, and this example of that came today.
To take away our rights and to take history backwards.
Most Americans would probably agree that voting is at the heart of not just democracy, but a just system of government.
In the aftermath of the Civil Rights Movement, including the famous march in Selma, Alabama, Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act in 1965.
Every American citizen must have an equal right to vote.
Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act required jurisdictions with a history of disenfranchising voters to obtain approval from the Department of Justice before they could make any changes to voting practices or procedures.
That's right. This Section 5 had a huge impact on black voter registration, particularly in the South. To take one example, in Mississippi.
Despite its impact, the courts began taking away some of its power in 2013 and again in 2021.
In voting. The first decision, Shelby County versus...
In Shelby versus Holder, John Roberts argued that the current voting laws that states were attempting to enact were no longer extreme enough in their discrimination to merit the pre-clearance process.
They took effect. And the second one, Brenovich versus DNC, essentially found that even if a voting restriction has a discriminatory impact, that in itself doesn't necessarily violate the Voting Rights Act. Those two decisions basically made it easier for some states to pass discriminatory laws, while at the same time making it much harder for anyone to challenge them.
A report from the Brennan Center shows that between January and July, these 18 states passed 30 laws that restrict voter access.
So, where does that leave us today? How does the Supreme Court balance the individual voter's right to vote against the state's obligation to arrange effective elections? Coming up on 6 Minutes.
In assessing the burden that a law places on the individual's right to vote, the court uses an analysis known as Anderson-Burdick balancing. In this sliding scale, the court weighs the burdens the state imposes on electoral participation against the state's potential benefits. The crux of this test is that the greater the burden imposed by the law, the more heavily scrutinized it will be by the court. As Professor Stephanopoulos notes, this sliding scale test has been used in 100% of recent Supreme Court cases to uphold state justifications for voting restrictions.
And so the combination of the court tending to find light burdens and tending to think that whatever state interests are offered are important, the conclusion is that the court basically upholds every voting restriction that's presented to it.
Why don't more Americans consider these restrictions to be an injustice? Let's look at our injustice pyramid or formula. We perceive injustice when we see power entrenching inequality without legitimacy. The right to vote is fundamental to our perception of a fair society. Restrictive voter laws place a disproportionate burden on voters of color and the poor. In the map shown of Dallas, Texas, there are no ID issuing offices in the southeast quadrant, where nearly 30% of people are black and 52% live in poverty. The rest of the city, where 22% are black and 17% live in poverty, has 8 ID issuing offices.
This certainly seems to satisfy the inequality aspect of the formula. What about legitimacy? There is a popular conception of America as a place where everyone has a voice in society. We have a vested interest in believing in this idea. The right to vote thus clearly implicates our system justification attributions. We desperately want to uphold the legitimacy of a system, and legitimacy is predicated on everyone being heard, and as a result, we don't see the system as unjust. Because there is not a clear or easy solution to the problem, to help ourselves feel more comfortable with his perceived injustices, it is also easier to blame suppressed voters for not being able to overcome state-imposed burdens, rather than examining the burdens themselves. System justification theory at work. To better understand this legitimizing argument, we can bring in our old friends Stick and Ball. When the Voting Rights Act passed, it was motivated in part because suppressed voters were considered balls, acted on by malicious state actors. Now, however, the state is cast as ball, striving to prevent elections from being overcome with fraud while stretching their limited budgets to somehow make it all work. Meanwhile, voters are cast as sticks, with the power to overcome any obstacle in their way if they just want to vote enough.
And how long did you wait to vote today?
5 hours.
5 hours?
Yes.
Didn't you feel it was totally worth it?
It was absolutely worth it, yes.
Yeah. Notions of in-group and out-group further help our system justification desire. It is very easy for us to make these attributions because the voters who bear the burden of long lines are disproportionately marginalized communities. And we know that we can ignore problems when we are motivated not to see them, and if we think those that are bearing the burden deserve to do so.
Given the prevalence of voter suppression and intimidation, solutions are needed to address the problems in court.
42 U.S. Code Section 1983, which was originally codified as the Ku Klux Klan Act, allows for individuals to bring private actions against state actors which infringe upon their civil rights. In voting rights cases, the circuit courts are currently split as to whether private actions can be brought under Section 1983 for voting rights infringements. In 2017, the Supreme Court refused to hear a case to clarify the issue.
Video of armed security guards outside a St. Pete polling place spurred fears of...
As such, the question remains if the legal system in any other way can respond to this democratic problem.
The motion is not agreed to.
Given the lack of clarity from the Supreme Court about the ability of private citizens to bring suits to secure the right to vote under existing law, we've decided to look to new avenues, specifically to the creation of a new kind of action under tort law. Professor Stephanopoulos shared his thoughts on bringing a private action under tort law specifically for issues of voter intimidation by state and private actors.
With the current polarization of election law, it wouldn't be shocking if the Pennsylvania courts would be willing to create some kind of new tort to stop vote suppression, voter intimidation, whether it's by private actors or by election officials.
In light of what Professor Stephanopoulos said, maybe we just need one creative and brave voter who can bring a lawsuit and change the narrative around voting in this country.
That's all from 6 Minutes for tonight. Thank you and good night.
Next week on 6 Minutes.
We've been eating them for decades, and we always thought they were made with real strawberries. But now, the court has a question before it. When do Pop-Tarts become Pop-Torts? Next week on 6 Minutes.